Hello, and welcome once again to Paier College's AS 321 Western Civilization Part 1. In today's class, we're going to begin what I consider the class proper. That is to say, we're going to start actually looking at the cultures that made up the West. And where better to begin the examination of such a thing than with the very bedrock, not just of our society, but of all societies, that earliest part of prehistory, the Paleolithic. But before we look at the past, let's take a minute to talk about how we view the past. Let's stop to consider, do researchers always have an immunity to bias or prejudice? Often, what we say about the past says at least as much about our culture as it does about the topic that we're trying to study. Now we'll begin with cavemen. The first time you thought of early humans back when you were just a child, you probably thought of them as cavemen. Ugh. It's certainly an evocative term, isn't it? It brings forth images of brutish, simple men with clubs and a ferocious attitude. Grok, ugh, Fred Flintstone. But our concepts of them is changing constantly. Yet our understanding of them is frequently tainted by the popular images we are presented with when we are children. Images like this guy, or Captain Caveman when I was a kid. Or perhaps slightly different images. Raquel Welch was one of the first cavemen, or women in this case, that I was introduced to. Actually, I have to admit, I love this movie for all sorts of reasons. None of them because it is a good movie, and all of them based around humor. But can anyone guess what I think is the most ironic element about this film? 1 million BC. Well, it's not just that it shows humans and dinosaurs living together. I mean, that's obviously never happened. And secondly, it's perhaps more importantly, the reason I love this is that absolutely none of the creatures shown in the movie were actually alive at the 1 million years BC period. At 1 million years BC, the dinosaurs were very long gone. They'd been gone by about 64 million years BC. And modern humans, at least the kind that Raquel Welch seems to represent, or John Richardson, if you're more interested in him, they hadn't developed for another 800 to 900,000 years. Still, this is an image of how we thought of cavemen that has lasted for decades. Now, over time, our ideas about cavemen have become more sophisticated. Concepts and ideas have grown as our understanding and our finding and discovery of new pieces of information have also grown, and these have been reflected in the media. We get a vague Australopith in the form of Chaka when I was growing up in Land of the Lost. You get Ringo Starr as Caveman, and you get Daryl Hannah as whatever her name was in the Clan of the Cave Bear. A much more sophisticated image than Raquel Welch, I assure you. So, that by about the year 2008, the image we portrayed in the media of cavemen was significantly different. We use the date 10,000 BC rather than 1 million BC, and that's at least a beginning of the start. And rather than fighting dinosaurs, we have mammoth hunters fighting smilodons, that is saber-toothed tigers for some of you. And yes, indeed, we came a long way in our depiction of cavemen, because now, in 2008 at least, we showed scantily clad men instead of scantily clad women. So yes, in general, the images do remain the same. Even in more scientific representations of the past, such as the ones I'm showing here, we have long represented earlier hominids as thick, dull primates. Now, note this. Note the images and everything you can see about them. Everything from their hair to their posture and more. And think about it. Some of you will probably note more than others that they portray what we think of as primitive. So what can you tell me about these images? What elements of these images, I should say, stand out to you? Think about them, describe them in your mind. Now, I won't bore you with a long discussion of one of the fundamentally most interesting topics that ever faced humankind. We instead will sort of glaze over it because we just don't have time. Though, if people are interested, we might be able to come up with a class focused on human evolution. Now, instead, we will just briefly touch upon this topic by noting the tree of evolution, which has all sorts of issues with it. But for our purposes, it does a good enough job of showing how things are believed to have progressed. Now, I'm going to say a couple of things very quickly about it. First of all, as I said at the beginning of this class, I do not ask you or anyone to believe in evolution or any other theory of creation. I do ask that you know it. What you believe is wholly your own, but what you believe should be based on knowledge. And whether you accept that knowledge or reject it, that's your perspective. I'm perfectly happy that you believe what you believe, as long as you know the facts that are out there and can judge them and whether or not they suit what your belief system is or not. Also, I'd like to point out that the term progress is a terrible term when we speak of evolution, because in one sense, each of these characters that we have shown up here was a perfect adaptation to the environment around them, as proven by the fact that modern humans exist today. Because, assuming the modern theory of evolution is correct, they survived long enough to reproduce, and many of these lines adapted as the world around them changed into forms more appropriate for the changing environment. Also, many of them lasted far longer than modern humans have lasted thus far. And here we see them presented as the usual suspects. Just to give you an idea of their relative heights and what they basically looked like. Now, you're not expected for this course to know what all of these are. That would be another course, as I said. But this is designed to give you an idea of what their stature and forms looked like when they were compared to one another. But just as important, look at how they are portrayed. The portrayal of each of these people says an awful lot about us. Not so much the individuals illustrated here, but about our preconceptions of what it is to be modern human, what it is indeed to be civilized. So then, let's then look at each of these usual suspects a little more closely, a little more personally, and a little more up in their face. The first of them we're going to look at is the Australopiths, and they are associated with what's called the Oldowan tool set. Here you can see this most classic type of Oldowan tool over on the left. It is a Oldowan hammerstone. You can see that it's clearly been used and modified. It doesn't look just like a rock. You can see areas where it's been smashed, but it's not terribly complex. It is still basically a rock. And next to it here on the right, we see a depiction of the Australopith who made it, or at least just a representation of what we think they looked like. As you can see, and as we can tell from the skeletal remains, they looked an awful lot like upright standing chimpanzees. They were, in many ways, a savanna version of a chimpanzee. That is not to say they were chimpanzees, but they had very similar characteristics to modern-day chimps, except they stood upright and had longer legs. Now, following the Australopiths, the next group we'll look at is the Homo habilis, that is the handyman or man handy if you're going to break down their name. And they were slightly larger brain casing than the Australopiths. But what is most interesting about them is that their tools were much more sophisticated. As you can see in these picture here, what you see is part of the Acheulean toolkit, where it was clearly modified from the beginning. Now, what we're showing in this picture is what's referred to as an Acheulean biface, or an Acheulean hand axe. And if you ask me, this is one of the greatest achievements of any hominin ever. It is effectively a Swiss Army rock. See, it has a pointy bit you can stab with, a sharp edge which you can cut with, and a blunt end, which the guy's holding it by, which makes it both easy to hold and, we can tell from use wear, chips in the stone that were there, it can also be used as a hammer type tool. Not only was it an amazingly versatile tool, but it and the other tools that came along with it, things such as stone knives and stone scrapers, lasted for millions of years until we see a new technology appear in the West, in Europe and in the Near East, and that is what we call the Musitarian. And that, by the way, brings us a little bit more into the West. Now, I won't go into too much detail about this, and I won't go into a long discussion, but this gives you an idea of where we're talking about. And there are a lot of species we haven't discussed. So this is the Australopith tree over this way, and it leads over to the Paranthropus. Then you get Homo habilis and various others. You'll note that many of these coexist at the same time, including Homo erectus comes along and moves up like this, and Homo ergaster. And that you end up getting Homo heidelbergensis, which we'll discuss in a bit, and eventually Homo sapiens. But the Musitarian was not actually created by any of those. No, the Musitarian was created by Neanderthals. Now, the Musitarian is a much more complex and complicated tool-making technique than anything else you can see. Here, you can see the difference in the style and technique between these and, say, the earlier techniques. See how the blade in the upper right-hand corner is cut so that you can use the natural form of the rock to make a perfect handhold? See how the finer stonework was done, with more chipping and more detail to create a sharper, more useful edge. This was all made and created because they used what is called the Levallois technique. The Levallois technique is the method used for all Musitarian tool types. And it is a much more complex manner of building something than we had previously seen. You see, previously, you get a rock, say with the Acheulean period or the Oldowan period, you get a rock and you take it and you shape it into what you want, pretty much straight on. Whereas the Mousterian technique is characterized by creating cores and reducing those into more and more refined tools. So you start with a large rock, you break off a piece of it, and then you can carry that piece around with you for a long time period and then chip blades off of it as they're needed. And as you can see, the final tool type doesn't really look a lot like the beginning tool type. Somebody had an idea in their head of what they needed and saw something that looked nothing like it, and by having numerous steps in between, figured out how to make what they wanted in there. Now, that shows a lot of forethought and planning that did not exist in the earlier tools. So the question is, who made these tools? Who invented this technique? The technique was utilized by individuals we frequently picture as cavemen, the most common image of cavemen. Homo neanderthalis, or Neanderthal man. Now, I could go on for ages about these guys, but for our purpose here, we're really only going to talk about a few things. First, they lived in the West. In Europe, the Near East, and a few sites in North Africa, with most of their remains being found in Europe. That is why we're talking about them, because Neanderthals began in the West and only existed in the West. Secondly, they were a different species, but one that could breed with our own. We know this because there are some among us who have the remnants of DNA, Neanderthal DNA, within our bloodstream, a maximum of 5%. Thirdly, they were in many ways just cold adapted humans. There were at that time woolly mammoths and woolly rhinos. Well, these are the equivalent of woolly humans. And while we don't have time here to talk about it, those adaptations probably had a not too small part to do in their replacement by fully modern humans. They were so well adapted to the environment they inhabited during some of the worst parts of the Ice Age that when it changed, when it became, believe it or not, even colder, they could not adapt. And so they were replaced by modern humans whose physique was better suited to the expanded tundra and whose ability to adapt to the environment whose ability to adapt the environment to themselves was much more sophisticated. Now, these are both representations of Neanderthals, and what do you notice about the way they are portrayed? I want you to stop and think about it. Pause the video if you need to, and calculate. What can you say about these depictions? What do they look like? Compare them back and forth. Now, you want to know what's funny? We have discovered something very important about Neanderthals once we were able to look at their DNA. Once we began examining their genetic material, we learned a lot about both the Neanderthals and ourselves. And that then brings us to our fourth point. Homo neanderthalis most probably did not look like this. Think of all those pictures we saw of early man, those first ones you examined. Think about what you thought. Now, after our genetic examinations of the genetic material, we discovered that Neanderthals looked like this. They had a mutation in their MCR1 location of the genes that gave them fair skin. And that kind of makes sense, since they were adapted to cold and dark environments. And fair skin gives an advantage in that. Oh, it gives you a terrible disadvantage to being able to survive ultraviolet light. And if you take a redhead such as that, or myself, back when I had hair, and throw us in the desert, we're almost certainly going to die, if not of burns, then of eventual cancer that would cause. However, having fairer skin also allows us to absorb more vitamin D from the sun. So when we moved up north, or I should say when the Neanderthals moved up north, I am not a Neanderthal. Well, very much of one anyways. But when the Neanderthals moved up north, they were given an advantage because when they developed that mutation, they were less likely to develop rickets. That's a disease that occurs when you do not get enough vitamin D. It's why there's vitamin D added to milk. And rickets creates bow legs and bent bones. So, because you're not getting enough vitamin D. People who are fairer skinned are less likely to have rickets because they're going to be getting more vitamin D from the sun. Although they are also more likely to be burned by the sun and get mutations that will cause cancer. So all of this shows us something pretty important. Not just about our ancestors, but about ourselves. For we have long presented dark-skinned peoples as being primitive, and light-skinned people as being somehow more civilized. But it was the Neanderthals who had the fair skin. And when we find fully modern humans first arriving in the West, they were almost certainly black or at least very dark-skinned. Modern humans were descended from dark-skinned people. And whereas it is possible that they had some interbreeding with Neanderthals, that's not where their light skin probably comes from. Now, in a moment, we're going to look at the modern Homo sapiens in much more detail. But first, I want you to think about what does this tell you about the people who have created 100 years worth of models or more than 100 years worth of models. And what does it tell you about ourselves? I do find it interesting that we associate dark-skinned people as being more primitive if you look at the way we've portrayed them in the past, but in fact, it turns out that they are the more sophisticated of the populations. Regardless of that, the world changed. The world became colder. It became tundra. The Neanderthals could not survive very readily in the very cold tundra. They were adapted for forest living. And this individual and other fully modern humans appeared on the scene. This individual is called Cro-Magnon man. This is the real deal. If you've heard the term Cro-Magnon, well, that's his skull right there. And with him, he brought a remarkable series of technologies. As striking a set of developments as the Musitarian technology was over the Acheulean. This was a revolution the likes of which the world had never seen before, probably the greatest surge in technology that humanity has ever produced. Now, so far, I have compared these populations to Neanderthals as if they were a separate species, and that modern humans replaced the Neanderthals. But that's not wholly the case. And indeed, there are some relatively new bits of evidence that suggest that it's not at all the case. You see, for while the Neanderthals as a species died out, some of them appear to have interbred with modern humans. We can tell because we see their genetics appearing in modern populations. So, while as a species they are gone, some of their descendants live amongst us still, primarily amongst populations in the West, and primarily, oddly enough, among the populations of Italy and Southern Europe. That may seem surprising to you, but it just goes to show that you can't tell what's going on. It does make sense, however, because that is also the area where most of the Neanderthals lived. Too much further north of that was covered with ice. Moving forward, it's important to recognize that regardless of modern humans replacing Neanderthals or them just interbreeding, they did. The Neanderthals were gone by the end of the Upper Paleolithic, by the beginning of the Upper Paleolithic, I should say. And indeed, at that time, at the beginning of the Upper Paleolithic, there was a huge migration out of Africa. Now, there's a lot of discussion about this theory, and while some people still believe that modern humans evolved separately and simultaneously around the globe, in general, most physical anthropologists now believe that humans came out of Africa about 270,000 years ago. And certainly they had come out by about 130 to 115,000 years ago. No, this does go outside the topic, but I bring it up because it does influence us. For if we are to discuss the West as a concept, we need to understand what comes before the West as a concept. So we'll talk about it just a little bit. But I will also note that when we're saying they came out of Africa, you will also note, that Neanderthal populations did not disappear until about 40,000 years ago. So there was a very long time period where two sentient, indeed solvent races existed side by side and interacted with each other. And that is fascinating to me. Now, what we see after this period is a true revolution in the artifacts and material culture that we find in Europe and elsewhere as well, but we're going to be focusing on Europe. And indeed, what we see is not just one revolution, but many revolutions. And while at first they don't seem very different than the 100,000 plus years of Musitarian that preceded them, we very, very quickly see what it is that makes modern humans different from other hominids. What we also see here happens around the world at slightly different times as populations of modern humans moved into those areas. But again, we're going to focus on Europe and the West because, well, that's what we're studying. And in Europe and Near Eastern Asia, we see a development of items that shows a transformation of functions and of form. And we see the first introduction of the abstract concept that we call art. What art really represented at that time and why it appears, it's anybody's guess. but it does appear, and it appears at this time during the Upper Paleolithic. So let's take a little bit of time to look at how it developed. As I noted, the Upper Paleolithic, the time period we associate with the coming of modern humans, is broken into a fairly substantial number of subgroups. And we will look at those briefly. From the Chattelperronian to the Augnacian to the Graversian to the Solutian to the Magdalenian. We'll get into all of that. But we'll start because each of these periods shows a change in the material culture that is found during them. And let's begin by looking at the Chattelperronian, which occurs at around 37,000 BP, that is before present. And that's where we find recognizably different traditions that follow technology for modern humans than those that predated them. And they're developed to match their new European environment. So, the Chattelperronian, the first period of the Upper Paleolithic, and it's the earliest examples of early Paleolithic technology that we have in Europe. We do have earlier stuff elsewhere, again, primarily in Africa. But it is so early that it is often debated in Europe whether or not it is modern or Neanderthal in nature. The Chattelperronian has a variety of Musitarian tool types that are found with it, but it is also characterized by the presence of backed knives known as the Chattelperronian points or knives, such as the one we see pictured there. They were called backed because they would have been placed within a wooden framework and used as a cutting implement, sort of like the saws of a teeth. Now, the date that this first appears on the scene is of some debate as well, and some people say it's about 37,000, while others say it's about 45,000. It's hard to tell due to the overall similarity with the Musitarian tips, but similarly, its end dates are standardly around 33,000, while others say they're as late as 29,000. And really, it's not a very exciting technology, I'll be honest with you. However, what comes next is... Welcome to the Aurignacian period. That is between 35,000 to 29,000 BP before present. And that shows us the start of the real technological revolution associated with the coming of modern humans. There is a dramatic change in the material culture at this time, a change that represents not just the development of how things are made, but also shows a fundamental change in how people think. It has a very heavy emphasis on blade technology, including both the Levallois technique and a new prismatic core technology, which entails the preparation of a nodule to create a flat striking platform. And that is followed by the removal of blades around the periphery of that flat striking platform. One also gets the clear introduction of bone-based technology, though there is a question, of course, whether or not this existed before this or not, because after all, the bones just probably didn't survive. But we do find them here in the Aurignacian. The Aurignacian also sees a difference of another kind. We see the introduction of less pragmatic objects. We get shells, bone, teeth, and ivory that are perforated. That is to say, they have holes driven through them, as if they were used as jewelry. And indeed, one also frequently gets full necklaces found in association with bodies. Those by themselves would suggest that this is actually a necklace. Personal ornaments. We had never seen that clearly represented before in any population. And now we have it. Then there's this. Perhaps most dramatically, we also get the appearance of what is clearly, without a doubt, artwork at around this time. Now, don't get me wrong, the cave paintings may not have been art for art's sake, if that's how you define art. Indeed, we can see in the bottom two figures that we put here, there are times where images overlap each other, one right on top of the other. And you may note on the one on the right that you may see an ibex or a reindeer. I really can't tell which. Whereas then immediately afterwards, a big woolly mammoth was drawn right on top of it. Well, we don't know if it's immediately afterwards, but it did appear on top of it. And on top of that is a clear horse's head. On the left, there are numerous horse heads overlapping, and all on top of something else. Goodness knows what it is. You can't tell. There are too many horses' heads. It was as if it were not the image that was important, but the process of making the image that was important. And that is pretty fascinating in and to itself. But we don't know. We don't know because there are no written records, because archaeology does not provide written records unless you're dealing with a historic period. Regardless, no matter how you cut it, it seems that this period has already shown a significant difference to all the earlier ones. The presence of clear artwork, of graphic representations of things that are not utilitarian in nature, or at least not just utilitarian in nature. As for the other, more mundane elements of day-to-day life, well, subsistence appears to have remained based on big game, with little use of fish or plants or birds that we find through the archaeological record, though preservation in these materials does make it hard to tell whether or not that's the case, or if it's just that things rotted away before we could find them. About this time, you also see a rise of what's called the out of the caves movement, where more camps appear across a wider range of settings. This has been interpreted as reflecting the way in which the land was used and a greater degree of mobility amongst the population. There's a greater use of temporary, and special purpose camps, as opposed to what we see earlier, which appear to be single base camps where everybody comes back. Of course, if there's a giant ice sheet on top that you're camping on, it would be hard to tell whether or not that camp survived because the ice sheet melted. There's also what appears to be trade occurring between populations, with different types of flint being uncovered from hundreds of kilometers away from where they would naturally have occurred. Though this does represent the question is whether or not this represents an exchange system or a tendency for some individuals to range farther and farther afield, bringing raw materials with them. We don't really know whether that was the case or whether it was that there was trade. But either way, it shows a change in people's behavior. And this brings us to about 29,000 BP, where we get introduced to the Gravetatian period, which in different areas overlaps with the Aurignacian. The Gravetatian technology notes an increase in the finesse of the blades. Much more delicate work is going on the blade pieces than previously, and there's a distinct form of retouching the tools. By retouching, that means taking a tool and sharpening it again after it's been used. The appearance of ground stone technology is also crucial at this point. That is the use of one stone on top of another to grind seeds or nuts. You take a big stone, on top of it you put the nuts, you put a smaller stone on top of it, and you use the two to grind each other, much like mortar and pestle, except, well, without quite a nicely defined mortar or pestle. Doing this appears to have opened a new range of food sources that previously couldn't be digested because they're already pre-ground, and they were very difficult to digest even if they could be digested. One also gets eye needles, that is, sewing needles with eyes in them, the same way that we have sewing needles that we use today. And that suggests the making of tailoring of cloth and a much more sophisticated and easily done form of sewing and patching materials together. We also see the appearance of new art forms, including what becomes known as the Venus form, and it's ubiquitous. You find this throughout time. You find this symbology all over Europe appearing at the Goethean. These depictions of women with high emphasized stomachs, breasts, and bottoms are frequently stylized and normally have stubby little arms that are practically, or legs, practically ignored. Often the heads are practically ignored as well. These are figures that are frequently called upon to note the existence of an ancient matrilineal or matriarchal society or gynecogy, that is to say, a society ruled by women. However, all we really know is that there was a clear emphasis on certain elements of the female form. What that is meant to be, why they did that, is anybody's guess. What's interesting is you don't tend to see the same emphasis on the male form at that time. Now, does that mean that women were considered more important because they're more frequently shown in art? I don't know. However, if one looks at the magazine racks of modern day society or even 1970s America, you'll see that there's also a lot of depiction of women and women's body parts. I don't think in those circumstances it suggests a gynecogy or matriarchal society. So it's important to remember that whereas this can suggest the importance of women, it can also suggest objectification of women. Who knows? The Solutrean follows this time period, and that is a very interesting time period. In Eastern Europe and much of Asia, it overlaps with the East Gravethian period, and in Northeast Asia, it overlaps with the Maltal, a period which probably predates the Solutrean. Now, one thing can be said about the Solutrean is that things suddenly got a lot colder a lot quicker at this point. And in the Americas, we find that what's corresponding with the Solutrean is probably the earliest dates for settlement and occupation. But the Americas have very scant evidence for this. Even so, there are some who suggest that a similarity between some of the earliest materials culture coming out of the Americas can be associated with the Solutrean. Now, and they use that to suggest that some of the early colonizers of North America would have come from Europe. Now, that is overstating it just a little bit. Indeed, most of the evidence suggests an Asian-based population for Europe. And the vague similarity between what is called the Solutrean points and what's called a Clovis point could and probably is purely functional at that time. Let me show you. That is a Clovis point, or in one case, a fulcrum point. Right next to it, on the left-hand side of the screen, you will see the Solutrean points. And whereas there is a general similarity of a big bladed object, you can hardly say that they are definitely the same. For one thing, the Solutreans have no shoulders, but I can get onto that forever. Now, regardless of whether or not there's a North American connection, what we do know about the Solutreans is, well, not a lot. They lived during the climax period of the Ice Age, when it was absolutely coldest and where the ice sheets were largest, and that would have limited their movements. Their points were remarkably large, but also better than the previous styles, and also tended to be limited in the material that they were made out of. People were therefore getting pretty picky and pretty choosy about what they made their tools from. This is probably in part because the new technologies could not be readily applied to just any form of stone. They had to be using a particular type of stone, like flint or chert. They also had a high use of they also had a high use of horse and reindeer than in previous periods, particularly horse. And they primarily seem to have lived in caves and rock shelters, or at least this is where we find most evidence of them compared to other periods where they also appeared to have done some cave art and the like. And that then leads us to the Magdalenian period. As time moved forward, both in Europe and indeed in the rest of the Old World, so too did technology and art develop, particularly through this Paleolithic. And at the Magdalenian, 17,000 to 11,000 BP, that is before present, we see quite a lot of development. Here, you can see some examples of lithic technologies, which show a reasonable level of additional sophistication, particularly in the ability to make very thin but still usable blades and points. And the small blades are thought by many to represent the advent of bow technology, of bow and arrows. And that would really have made a difference to the lives of these people. Certainly, it was present by the end of the glaciation period, so bows and arrows appeared at the very end of the Paleolithic in the Magdalenian period. We also see, perhaps more notably, the development of bone and antler technologies, including the introduction of these rather stylized barbed points, points that are designed to stick in an animal. They are believed to have represented the introduction of a harpoon-based technology. Now, what is the difference between a spear and a harpoon? That's a good question. Some people think of it as a harpoon floats, some people just think of it as harpoons being water-based, but really, a harpoon has a removable point, whereas a spear has a fixed point. That is to say that one is intended to throw a harpoon, and that point is supposed to stay in the animal it hits while the shaft is removed. And frequently, the shaft has a tether attached to it, and so does the point, and that's intended to limit the animal's movement. You can see how that would be particularly useful at sea. Now, as far as the art world of the Magdalenian, the period sees a new style of cave art appear, including in new style of the types of animals portrayed, with a lot of horse, bison, reindeer, auroch, that is wild cattle, big, giant, mean wild cattle, and some mammoths and the like. Most notable in the cave art, however, is the increase in the portrayal of human and humanoid images. Like that individual up on the top left-hand corner there. He's called the Sorcerer, and clearly he's a figure with both anthropomorphic and zoopomorphic features. That is to say, he is both representing a person and an animal at the same time. But perhaps more importantly, an expansion of portable artwork is found. There are a larger number of small statues and engravings on pragmatic items, such as addle-addles and the like. Addle-addles is something you use to help you throw a spear further. And you see a larger number of beads and necklaces appearing. Approximately 80% of all artwork from the Magdalenian represents portable art. That is really a big difference. It shows that art was being made at levels of much higher percentage than in the later periods. And it was being intended to be brought with you. Now, as far as social behavior goes, on a subsistence level, there's not much change from the Solutrean. People tended to use big game, and hunting seems to be the norm, with a large number of herbivores making up between 90 to 100% of the animal assemblages associated with habitation sites. Reindeer and horses in some areas make up the bulk of the prey, though in Spain you maintain a predominance of red deer and ibex. There are also some animals in the area, of course, such as grouse and fish, where those are making up a larger percentage of the animal assemblage than previously. There are also some evidence to suggest that the dog was domesticated at this time period, particularly in the Eastern Europe. Now, this is heavily disputed by some, and we know that by the Mesolithic, which follows on immediately afterwards, Mesolithic means middle stone, Paleolithic means old stone, but the Mesolithic immediately follows after the Paleolithic period of the Magdalenian, and you definitely get evidence of domestic dog at that point. But in Eastern Europe, we do see some hints that dogs were domesticated at this time. You also begin to get a number of open-air sites, like this recreation of a site found above. It shows an expansion out of the rock shelters back to that. Somewhere between 45 to 55% of the sites found are camps such as these, open-air sites, though most of these are found in the European Southwest. Now, just to give you an idea of what's happening elsewhere in the world at about the same time, because despite what we like to think about the West, it did not develop in a bubble. There were contacts with people from around the world at different levels, if not direct contacts, then indirect contacts. So, we'll begin by looking at what was going on in Northeast Asia, where we get the Juktai culture. Forgive me, I don't really know how it's pronounced. Juktai culture, identified first in northeastern Siberia, and mostly spoken about in English in relation to the possible settling of North America. Whereas if you look in Russian, there is a much larger discussion of them by themselves. Unfortunately, I don't read Russian, so I can't tell you what any of that says. Regardless, and regardless of their relationship to the first inhabitants of North America, the Dukai were a culture in and to themselves that existed for a period of more or less overlapped with the Magdalenian period in Europe, but had a different and still remarkable technology of their own, particularly in their blade work. Really quite stunning things coming out of Asia at that time. Meanwhile, back to Europe. What we see now at the end of this period, at the end of the Magdalenian, is another set of changes. Changes not just in technology, but more importantly, in the environment. Because at this time, there's a global warming period that begins, and it notes the melting of the large glaciers that has covered much of Europe. And with that melting comes flooding and the change of climate and the like that leads to changes in the material culture and how people lived. As the sea levels began to rise, we see large swaths of open land get closed and covered by water. And within a few thousand years, they go from being large open expanses to areas that are underwater. For example, Doggerland. Compare this image, which shows the sea levels at the climate, I should say, beginning in the Holocene. And note the sea level around Britain. See how actually Britain is attached to the rest of the European peninsula. Now compare that to this, which shows that at its level for the most of the Holocene, including today, huge swaths of what were once fertile land got covered in ocean. If there was ever a global flood, such as described in many different religions, this was the time period in which it would have occurred. And with this transition, we see the introduction of new technologies, new lifestyles, and new adaptations to that changing environment. Indeed, in Europe and Western Asia, this period is called the Mesolithic, which means middle stone. And it usually has a variety of names elsewhere based on the actual typology and typography of artifacts and the like. Here, however, for this class, we'll just call it the Mesolithic. And the Mesolithic is a period by which, at the very beginning of the Mesolithic, humanity has already spread across almost all of the globe. It is a period that in itself sees fantastically important developments that change the fundamental way that humans have lived on the earth up to this point. For it is here that we get what will become the most significant change in modern humans' lifestyles. It is here where we begin to truly see the influence that humans have on the world around us. It is where the domestication of animals expands dramatically, and, perhaps more importantly, where agriculture begins to be introduced. In the Near and Middle East, the Mesolithic is a very short period, for it soon becomes the Neolithic, a period which is noted with the advent of domesticated wheat and other grains. In Asia, we see rice begin at the end of the Mesolithic. And while I could spend a whole class easily focused on the Mesolithic, we have a great deal to cover, and so the next class will be focusing on this, the introduction of agriculture and the development of urban settlements. For as modern humans began to spread out across the world, they began to change that world. They began to tame animals, adopt them, sometimes for food, such as with cattle and sheep, and sometimes as working animals, such as with dogs, though dogs were also at times food. Yet paradoxically, as humans continued to spread more and more widely across the globe, they also started to become more sedentary. They began to live in more and more permanent habitations. Indeed, even in settlements. Now, they did this either as a result of having more permanent homes or as having a cause for more sedentary lifestyles, such as being able to domesticate grain. But they started domesticating plants. And with that, we began to change the world we live in more dramatically than we have ever seen. So here we see some quick pictures of Mesolithic artifacts. You see cornstones in the middle. You see a very wide variety of blade types on the upper left. Cornstones in the middle, that's used for grinding grains. Mesolithic tombs. Now these are tombs that are built outside on hills that are made out of large stones. They're also called megalithic tombs. Often these are associated with the Neolithic, but here you begin to see them at the end of the Mesolithic, and it shows not just that we're living in a landscape, but we're impacting and intentionally changing that landscape by creating monuments on them. We'll talk about that at a different time. You can also see the introduction of things like polished stone axe heads, such as you see below on the bottom left, and polished stone maces, as well as spindle whorls. Spindle whorls, such as you see in the center of the bottom left, as well as in the center bottom picture, spindle whorls were important for creating woven materials. That suggests that we are actually weaving different fabrics, whether they are made out of animal hair or out of a type of cotton or other plant fiber. You also see larger stone axes, such as you see on the side, that are polished and look almost ornamental. All of these develop even further and more significantly in the Neolithic. But that is a different story.